So first of all, my name's Tim Wainwright. Thanks for hopping into this session. The competition is pretty fierce, so I will not waste your time. I'm here from Catholic Social Action, which is a Catholic advocacy group committed to like a whole life perspective, and also from the Solidarity Policy Center, a non-sectarian think tank who put a paper together with this title, and that I've stolen from a little bit of what we've talked about. So nukes, guys, you're here to talk about nukes with me. The war has been around for a long time. It's pretty bad. Most people agree. Yes? So because of that, there's been rules about war for a long time, right? Just like here, no hitting below the belt. Now, since the beginning, not targeting combatants was a big part of that. So here you have a page from one of the ancient Indian Sanskrit epics, which talks about not destroying certain trees or targeting women and children, right? Sort of sounds a little progressive for its time. And let's talk about the Book of Deuteronomy, in which case if you are going to lay siege to a city, you have to offer peace terms to that city first, and only if they make war on you can you go forward and besiege the city. And then, of course, we could look at the caliph who inherited from the Prophet Muhammad, and we could take a look at what he said, which is about specifically not targeting non-combatants as well for any of the Muslim armies. So, there's a big consistency there. And then we can fast forward a little bit to the Geneva Accords of the Dark Ages, which were led by some monk in Ireland named Madumnach, whose mom appeared to him in a dream and yelled at him that he was not doing enough to protect women and children and the vulnerable in the petty wars that were going on. So he called a council and made it happen and got everyone, all these little chiefs, to write a big Latin document. So what I'm trying to say is it's been around for a long time. But unfortunately, ever since the idea of rules of war have been around, the idea of breaking them flagrantly has also been around. And a big part of that has been the bomb. Bombs have also been around for a very long time. Here is the oldest depiction of a bomb that I was able to find from Korea in the 400s or 500s. But of course, here's a slightly less old bomb. So they've been around for a long time, but the big thing in pre-modern warfare that tended to tilt the balance away from doing total war is people had a vested material interest in not destroying arable land or an entire city's population, since sort of, unfortunately, we'd like to think that morality had something to do with that, but really it's because when you're living in a subsistence level, you don't want to destroy crops and fertile soil, and you don't want to destroy a bunch of people who could be a free labor pool for you in the future. So pretty grim still, but tip the scales of balance away from total war. That started to change in the modern era. So one widely considered first example are some of the total settlement and town massacres that took place on the American frontier during our settlement. And as you'll see later, little spoiler alert, America will come back in this story once or twice. And here is a slightly more up-to-date old bomb with a very impressive mustache to track how bombs, yet again, are a feature of the modern set of total war. Now, the basics of a bomb, right, are you've got some sort of detonator device, you've got a chemical component that makes it go boom, and you have a way to somehow target that to be deployed against a time mechanism or some other sort of trigger, right? So that's the basic infrastructure of how a bomb works. And this would be some, we're getting here into the 19th century, early 20th century, getting towards things that can be delivered outside of a battlefield, maybe over a very long ways away, like a shell, or from from aircraft, right? And so then we get where we're all going, which is when these cheerful guys, the smiles just really get me, to be honest, along with some help from some of these guys, made this, which is the little guy. And then, of course, as we all know, they dropped it here, and it did this, and it did this. That is the before on the left and the after on the right from the Hiroshima Memorial Museum. And there is a real life example. So it did this, 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 and this. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I think this audience knows full well how destructive these weapons are and doesn't need to be convinced of the evil of targeting massive civilian populations, right? It's but it is worth it. I don't think you can talk about this issue without bringing it up and reminding us of the reality of it, right? So moving on, we quickly get from 1945 to the rest of most of the 20th century, which is, man, if it can do that, then everyone's got to have one. Got to get me some of those nukes. And then we get to the massive global proliferation that we're all familiar with, right? And that is the situation that we are trying to solve from a whole life perspective. Now, there are some, again, I'm not going to try and persuade or preach to the choir here about any of the moral arguments, right? But I am going to reflect and try and arm us and remind us of some of the strategic arguments behind why these things are stupid and so dumb. And number one reason is that you can't use them. Because if you do, thanks to mutually assured destruction, you will also get used. And so you can't use them. You can never use them on no account. And therefore, they're no actual use, right? And there's a whole scholarly literature from a purely strategic perspective and a purely foreign policy perspective, making fun of the idea of mutually assured destruction and like the strategic nuclear doctrine of like the early 20th century, purely from security. And there's a couple more reasons that I'll just dive into here real quick. So number one, besides how destructive they are, right, is the infrastructure required to build and maintain and upkeep not just one, but the entire nuclear arsenal is incredibly expensive, incredibly complex, and incredibly specialized. And that is very, very, very hard to maintain, especially due to some of the other shifts that I'm going to talk about next. But to make a broad point, the capacities of states to maintain this infrastructure, even in the superpower states, have deteriorated over the last 40 years to a sort of, even makes it into the New York Times about some of the lax security regulations and technology failures at some of the Air Force bases where, there's supposed to be maximum security maintaining some of this stuff. So again, not to sound too, Western superiority, but if that's what's going on here, imagine what must be going on somewhere not as civilized as us. The horror. And of course, that means that in addition to other factors, right, there is more likelihood of a nuclear weapon being detonated by a terrorist group or a insurgency or a non-state actor or a non-superpower state than there is of anyone on the UN Security Council going to nuclear war. So these weapons and their existence pose far more of a risk to national security live than they do if no one had them anymore and no one had to worry about them. So it's important to remember that there is an entire literature and background on this, on why having nuclear weapons is extremely dangerous and counterproductive purely from a Machiavellian, realist, foreign policy, grand strategy guru perspective. Not that, that applies to any of the good people here. So let's talk a little bit about the anti-nuclear weapons movement and how that has fared over the years. So it's hard for us to fathom today as advocates just how strong the anti-nuclear movement was in the 20th century. It was probably larger in terms of broader appeal than even the civil rights movement. And certainly at its peak into the 70s and 80s, what you see here is a picture from a demonstration that reached over 1 million people in attendance, and this is in Central Park. And this is purely to stopping the bomb. So there were massive results from it. An entire governmental, you have here the societal track, and that was reflected in ongoing attempts at drawdown, at governance through things like the UN efforts to do it, as well as individual treaties between the major nuclear states, especially US and Russia. Ronald Reagan actually oversaw several treaties related to a drawdown of arms and warheads and stockpiles, right? You have SALT 1 and SALT 2, and there's a history of this producing real results. And so, unfortunately, that trend is no longer with us, right? Nuclear weapons are not a hot issue right now. If you look at everything, the full panoply of things that the peace community and the activist community are concerned with. And part of it is a reflective of the fact that the defense industry and the defense apparatus are not super or as concerned with it either. We've been focused on counterinsurgency and irregular warfare, et cetera, for the last 20, 30 years, right? It's been going great, if anyone's wondering. This is the last trend since 2004 of people researching nuclear weapons issues on Google. And so you can see that we have a steady downward trend. And I tried to find a comparison here, but pretty much everything else I used, Britney Spears, Cardi B, Rihanna, Drake, they all caused this blue line to basically become invisible, like perhaps at the bottom of my slide or screen here. So, but the intent was there. And so we're at this point now where, because of the decay of the infrastructure that I mentioned, and because of the ongoing weakness of central nation states to control things like terrorist groups and other less governed but still semi-sovereign entities, I will call them, to acquire elements involved in making rudimentary nuclear weapons, our loss of interest is unfortunately coming at a time where some of the dangers posed by nuclear weapons are higher than they have been since 1989. So it's an unfortunate combination, and you can see this a little bit here in how we track the decline of the overall nuclear stockpile here. And this is just the US, but it is pretty consistent with what Russia has done, and unfortunately offset by growth amongst a bunch of other countries. That's what we talk about when we talk about proliferation, right? So you can see that since the mid 90s, with a couple of exceptions during the Bush years, the annual reduction in our total stockpile has pretty much flatlined at about 15,000 warheads. And or at, a 0% change year over year. You can see that we're now hovering around a total stockpile of 5,000, which is much better than 15,000. There's a lot going on in this graph, right? And I'll make these slide notes available to everyone after the session. So, and you see this a little bit in analyzing the most recent two administrations, right? So let's talk about the presidency of Donald Trump, which was the biggest shakeup in US nuclear weapons doctrine in my lifetime, certainly. The and a noted departure from both George W. Bush, who has a reputation as a warmonger, right, with the neocons, and from Barack Obama, who has a more progressive reputation, right? But both George W. Bush and Barack Obama presided over significant arms reduction and nuclear non-proliferation treaties, especially with Russia. And the trend until the Donald Trump administration was towards further drawdown. Um, you have a widely you have four former foreign secretaries and chiefs of state going around and explicitly campaigning not just for nuclear drawdown, but for global zero, right? For really the first time in modern sort of post Cold War life, you have a push for getting rid of all nuclear weapons. And it's being talked about and at least spoken about as a goal by policymakers, not just by people in the advocacy community, right? And Donald Trump shakes this up in a few ways, most of which were extremely damaging. A couple of which, though, I want to highlight as impulses that were good and needed for the future. Um, but first of all, he, as you might be able to see from the slide, talked about and expanded a new budget where he delivered a 25% increase in the previously uh, accrued and planned set aside spending on expanding and upgrading our nuclear infrastructure over the next 10 years for 634 billion, which you guys all know far outweighs any of the proposals we've seen for any of the stuff like COVID mitigation or universal health care or expanded child benefits and making these tax credits universal or anything else like that, right? But just to remind us of the priority weight here. But even more than just the uh, boost in defense spending, which is something that it's going to be almost impossible to get rid of. Even if we go to zero, there's no way to do this without effectively bribing the defense community and the defense contractors to be able to do stuff with these, even if it's just, a much shinier building to sit around and not use these nuclear weapons in or whatever. But the more damaging stuff was pulling us out of the long range nuclear treaty, which was just catastrophic, unfortunately, as well as the reluctance to engage in any sort of new nuclear drawdown treaties. Like the fact that we almost did not renew the New START agreement with Russia, which is the most up-to-date drawdown agreement with the second largest nuclear stockpile holder in the world, Russia, was concerning to a lot of people in the non-proliferation community. But we need to talk about the Trump administration by talking about North Korea, right? And the brinksmanship here was terrifying, right? It's been a while since we've seen Mr. Trump on Twitter, so here's a little screen cap for everyone to go down memory lane. But I mean, we were there for a tense few moments, especially after that. Remember that false alarm going off in Hawaii? This was really a relic out of that Cold War, early 20th and mid 20th century era, right? You're literally seeing these guys tweet back and forth each other about who has a bigger button. Yes, but the flip side of this is that Donald Trump was the first sitting US president to set foot in North Korea. And his willingness to speak to people that the foreign policy establishment considers beyond the pale to have any dialogue with until certain preconditions are met is, I believe, a good impulse and one that we should hold on to and sort of commend from that crazy time if we're looking for a silver lining of what happened, because the this issue is not going to be solved unless we bring everyone to the table, right? But that at a super high level, and we go into more detail on this in the paper, is the summary of the Trump administration. Drawdown from treaties, significant damage to it as a policy priority, increased spending for modernizing infrastructure and maintaining and adding new warheads to the stockpile, and a little bit of a shakeup in our willingness to dialogue. So Joe, right? He did something different. He campaigned against all this stuff. He was part of the Obama administration, which signed a bunch of new treaties. Unfortunately, not. His budget has 634 billion set aside for the same programs. Here's a headline from the Arms Control Association: Biden's disappointing first nuclear weapons budget. Here we have him going full steam ahead on all of Trump's policies, despite his campaign rhetoric. But there are some good signs here as well, and these are the things to watch here over the next 3 years to see what happens in this space. So first is the appointment of Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins as the Undersecretary for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. Ambassador Jenkins was on the board of Plowshare, which is an anti-nuclear weapons advocacy group, for a long time, and she is committed to Global Zero. So that is a fantastic appointment and one that we are going to have to watch. And another one to draw your attention to is the current National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. He was also in the Obama administration, and he played a key negotiating role in making the comprehensive agreement with Iran, the Iran nuclear deal, possible. And that is one of the biggest successes in nuclear policy in the 21st century, as we see it, right? So the fact that people like these are in key positions here are signs of hope and places that we're going to have to watch coming up here. But unfortunately, despite what a lot of us had hoped from what the platform Biden ran on and what we expected to see based on the history of his time as vice president and the priorities of the Obama administration, the response has been muted, and some of those hopes have been dashed by what we've seen so far. But it is early days, and we do have promising people in place there. So the places to watch are these names and the ongoing dialogue between Russia, less so, most importantly, China, which we are hearing about as a huge focus for the Biden administration. And China is currently on a tear to build up their own nuclear weapons stockpile. So getting back into talks with Russia, important. Getting back into the Iran deal, important. But there is currently no deal or no international agreement that China is part of or has signed with the US, Russia, and the other major nuclear powered states. And they're on a tear to get up their own arsenal. So that is, no pun intended. So that's going to be the biggest place to watch. These are going to be some of the key players. I've given you a little bit of background and history here. So hopefully that was, some of what you came to see. And boom, I'm on my 5-minute warning. And now I'll take any questions or anything else that I have. And I'm seeing the chat here. Let me see. Is the economy stupid? Let me see, do I have anything specifically in the Q&A? No. Uh-oh, were people getting sound? Okay. All right. That'd be a bummer. All right, cool. So John is asking, what's the best way to create some urgency around this issue? Um, how do we get people interested? That is the question, right? Um, that is the question. And it is harder now, I think, than ever to get people interested and activated simply because there is so much competition and so much noise in the space. Um, the there aren't any easy answers, unfortunately. We have to do all the things, like tell people about it and talk about it on social media and join up and donate and become members of and join the mailing lists of all of the groups who are currently working on this stuff. Get more involved, volunteer, and show up and scream at the politicians, right? That all of the above and doing that nigh impossible work and pushing that ball uphill are the only options, frankly. Um, and it might seem tough, but the stakes are pretty high, and there's a lot worse things you could do with your time. So I wish I had a more encouraging answer, but that's how I see it here. And Herb is yelling at us to stop. But one more question, if we have any. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks to everyone who joined. I really appreciate you listening to me blather on for a little bit. And hop on over in the booth and shoot me a note if you'd like to chat further. I'd love to speak. Thanks, guys.